All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started then. So good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to those folks here in person and those folks who are online watching as well. I'm Whit Salmweber. I'm a visiting professor here in the Department of Marine Affairs, and I really want to welcome you to this edition of the Honors Colloquium here, Sustaining Our Shores at the University of Rhode Island. This colloquium focuses on our shores and seas because we live in the ocean state. We face significant challenges associated with climate, socioeconomic disparities, and marine resource limitations. Also, the UN Decade of the Ocean is beginning, and with URI's great experience in coastal and ocean science and management, we have a responsibility to educate and help address these issues as we continue to advance our understanding of the marine realm. The Committee of Faculty and Staff has planned the Sustaining Our Shores Honors Colloquium to educate and encourage discussion and collaboration. The future of seafood is a global concern, and the fate of fish and other organisms is inherently linked to marine ecosystems and human activities and impacts. So throughout, we've been transitioning from coast and crisis to now the future of seafood and looking towards marine plastics as a challenge. These are the three main themes of the colloquium this semester. And we're closing out the future of seafood tonight with a panel discussion, a panel comprised of experts ranging from the global scale to the local scale, with views and perspectives brought from years in government or the private sector or on the water. I'm really excited tonight to introduce a panel composed of friends and colleagues from many years, including Russell Smith. Sorry, I'm just going to pull up the bio here. Who is a principal at Flen Consulting. He provides consulting services on ocean-related issues to both domestic and international organizations, focused on a range of topics including IUU fishing, protection of marine mammals, and the performance of resource management organizations. Prior to establishing Flen Consulting, Mr. Smith served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Fisheries at the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, where his responsibilities included overseeing NOAA's international fisheries and trade-related work and leading U.S. efforts to combat IUU fishing and seafood fraud. We also have Ms. Monica Jain. Monica Jain comes to us originally from the West Coast, though more recently in Florida. Monica is the Executive Director of Fish 2.0 and Manta Consulting. She is dedicated to growing networks that bring together fisheries and oceans and finance and impact investment. She launched and grew Fish 2.0 from 2013 to 2020 to create a network of quality entrepreneurs and investors to grow the sustainable seafood sector and capital flowing into it. She's worked with a huge number of entrepreneurs and investors in bringing over $300 million into participating ventures. In 2016, Monica was named an Ocean Champion by President Obama. Lastly, we have Sarah Schumann. She's a commercial fisherman who sails out of Point Judith, who dedicates her off-seasons to grassroots organizing and applied research on fisheries habitat, climate-resilient fisheries, and supporting the next generation of commercial fishermen. As a leader in the local seafood movement, she has pioneered the aspirational goal of ecosystem-based seafood marketing, in which seafood markets are balanced in proportion to the productivity of the full suite of edible marine species in a given ecosystem. Sarah is the author of Simmering the Sea, Diversifying Cookery to Sustain Our Fisheries and Rhode Island's Shellfish Heritage and Ecohistory. Lastly, we are joined by Azure Cygler. Azure is a marine policy expert at URI's Coastal Resources Center. Azure has a Master's in Marine Affairs from URI, and her graduate work focused on measuring the well-being of commercial fishermen in 3 New England ports, and how management measures have impacted their decision-making and conservation ethics. She has also been a commercial fisherman both here in the U.S. and abroad. She's going to be moderating the discussion tonight. So before moving forward, just a few reminders. I want to note that there are fire exits along the side and the back there. The restrooms are found off the foyer where you entered. Also, next week, Dr. Chelsea Rockman will be joining us to kick off the marine plastics segment of the Honors Colloquium. So lastly, before moving on to the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Ms. Crystal Mars-Baker to offer a land acknowledgement and blessing. Crystal is a citizen of the Narragansett Indian Tribe and the Indigenous Empowerment Education Coordinator for the Tamaqua Museum. As an Indigenous woman and educator, she has been involved in trainings related to historical trauma and its effects on tribal communities across Turtle Island. Following in the footsteps of her late father, Reverend Roland Mars, she has served as a spiritual leader at the Narragansett Indian Church. After a 15-year hiatus to raise her children, to return to work for the Narragansett Indian Tribes Health Center. She is a graduate of the University of Rhode Island, class of '96, and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Secondary Education and Social Studies. Crystal, I welcome you to the stage.
Waninatan ni tampawag. Good evening, friends. Natusawis Crystal Mars Baker at English set, ka paukwi tokikam at nahahagansik, ka ni nahahagansik nahyantik, kanupiam wit tuomuk, aki ninanog. My name is Crystal Mars Baker in English, in clear spring water which flows in Narragansett, and I am a Narragansett Niantic citizen. Welcome to the homelands of my people. It's a pleasure for me to be here, standing here with you this evening. Since my own childhood, these grounds have felt like my backyard. My father was a mailman at the Kingston Post Office just down the road from here. I used to join him on his deliveries to the homes surrounding this area. Several of my family members were employed here or students here, and I would visit them at their places of work and in their dormitories. And as a graduate of the University of Rhode Island and former employee myself, I have walked this campus from one end to the other, and I am proud to say my own daughter walks these grounds now as a freshman. In fact, as she was feeling anxious during her first weeks, I reminded her that she was walking on the homelands and in the spirit of her ancestors were all around her, and that she was not alone. So this land acknowledgement occasion is an important reminder for some, and information to others that the Narragansett people have always been here, and we are still here. And in fact, the name Narragansett Bay comes from the name of our people. We are a proud people who have extended the hand of fellowship and shared our spaces and our bounty with your ancestors as we do so with you now. The song which states, "This land is your land, this land is my land," is an untruth. A greater truth was written in his letter to the President of the United States when Chief Seattle stated, "The President in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land. But how can you buy or sell the sky, the land? The idea is strange to us. If we do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can you buy them?" He also wrote, "This we know, earth does not belong to man, but man belongs to earth." The selling of land was a foreign concept to a people who did not believe in ownership. Ownership is a concept and circumstance that was introduced and instituted by colonizers. You may or may not be aware of the many deeds and treaties initiated by the early colonizers to the indigenous peoples of the vast territories across this Turtle Island. The marks that sachems were used to represent their signatures as the seller to the purchaser, they did not understand that mark. However, one who has no interpretation or understanding of the language in which the paperwork was written, or the concept of selling, nor the writing of a language, and cannot and did not have the understanding of the depth and the result that that mark represented as it was made on those documents. This is but one part of history and why we stand here today acknowledging this place and these lands that were once the lands of the great and powerful tribe of Narragansetts. Respect, acknowledgement, and understanding are vital to relationships. those of the past, present, and those being forged for the future generations to come. But just hearing about these histories and happenings are not enough. Just acknowledging these histories and happenings are not enough. The hearers must be prepared to do something about it. Water accessibility to beaches, ponds, and rivers without cost, water rights for fishing, crabbing, oyster farming, etc., without the licensing fee, access to campgrounds and parks without cost are just a few minor actions that could be established for Indigenous peoples on their Indigenous homelands. But there are vast other opportunities for access that should be pursued and not just acknowledged. Tabatnawayan, I thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for that, Whit, and thank you very much, Crystal, for that beautiful acknowledgement. We're very happy to be here. I want to express gratitude to our wonderful guests, Russell, Monica, and Sarah, for coming some great distances in some cases, some short distances. That's irrelevant because their expertise is really welcomed, it's valuable, and it can teach us a lot about how to better sustain our shores. So I just want to say today that the format is very conversational. We want to keep it light. We welcome questions at any point, especially at the end as well. And we just hope that you'll sort of join us at this community table of a seafood feast, as it were, of knowledge with our great distinguished guests. So with that, I'd like to just sort of open it up with a question to all of you. If you were to pick one word, and you can cheat and maybe have a hyphenated word or maybe two, but if you could pick one word or so and describe the future of fisheries, the future of our seafood sector as a whole, what word would that be? And you could speak locally, you could speak nationally, you could speak on a global scale, whatever you choose. Russell, can I start with you?
I guess I can't say no.
You cannot say no.
Uncertain. I think that we are at a time in history where there's a recognition of, or there's a growing recognition of the importance of seafood economically, food security-wise, contributions to, say, climate and mitigating climate change. But we still have a lot of work to do to figure out how to use that to manage our fisheries in ways that are sustainable, in ways that are going to ensure that the seafood we enjoy now, the seafood that many people rely on now, both for their food and for their economics, is going to be here into the future, and that its use will be done in a way that is fair and equitable across various cultures and various people.
Monica.
So I have to use another negative word, unfortunately, but I was going to go with understaffed. And something that, as we look forward, so there's a cycle that's happening in seafood, and traditionally a lot of knowledge got passed down among the generations of the fishermen and the fishing families, and a lot of knowledge it wasn't like a formal apprenticeship, but it was an informal apprenticeship. And And that was at every level of the seafood supply chain. And that's happening less and less now. There's also, there's very few programs in the US that offer technical training for fisheries or for aquaculture. Like, people do science and people do other stuff, but the hands-on learning. How do you pack a fish? How do you pack a fish for freshness? How do you choose the best gear for a boat? How do you, how do you stock a fish tank for aquaculture? How do you tell when a fish it needs something because it has disease? Like, all of these things are being lost, and I've been hearing a lot about how the people that have been doing this for the last 40 years, who learned from their parents or their uncles or whatever, they're now getting older, and their kids don't want to do this, or they haven't taken the time or haven't had the people come that they could teach to. A lot of the younger people now want to do different jobs. And so the fact of the matter is, there's no way to run a seafood business without touching the fish ever. So people have to learn how to do this, and there have to be, we're going to have to deliberately create programs that teach this technical part of fisheries and aquaculture in order to have a healthy seafood industry. Because there's like, I don't know how we expect knowledge to get passed down, but it's not happening.
Well, my word is persistent, devoted, committed, proud, determined. It's quite true that I don't like the word national seafood sector, because it sounds like some economist spreadsheet. And when I think of fisheries, I think of the living, beating hearts of people like me and the people I work with in commercial fisheries. And it's true that we face uncertainties today that are unprecedented. And this is an industry that's faced a lot of challenges over the last 30 years, but they seem to just be mounting. As soon as people solve one challenge, 3 more show up. We're dealing with graying of the fleet, as Monica mentioned. We're dealing with offshore wind. We're dealing with climate change, things that an older generation of fishermen that Monica referred to, back then, people had to learn how to fish, which is hard enough, and find a market is hard enough. Now you have to learn all kinds of regulations. You have to learn how to be an effective speaker. You have to learn how to engage with the public, with people who may have no clue what it means to work outdoors with your hands, and yet you have to build relationships with those people because your fate is in their hands. They're the ones buying your fish. They're the ones, voting in the state where your port is located that could make decisions about whether that port is here in 5 or 10 years. And yet, despite all of these challenges, I had the privilege a year or 2 ago of traveling from Maine to North Carolina, interviewing young fishermen under 35. Young in the fishing industry is really like under 50, but we went for the under 35 crowd, and that changed my attitude so much because I saw so much hope, not in the sense of everything's, going great, this is, free and easy. It's hard. Being any food producer in this day and age is hard. But I saw people who were from fishing families. I met people who were not remotely from fishing families, like myself, who had gravitated toward this industry, thrown their lot in with it, and were going to do whatever it took to succeed and to stick with it, and, if possible, if their kids wanted to pass it on to their own children, who might be, 2 or 5 right now, but they're already looking ahead. And this is something that the older generation didn't do, and that's why we've had this sort of generational gap. There was a fisherman of a certain generation who said, I'm not letting my kid anywhere near a boat. I don't see a future in this industry. But the young fishermen I talked to 2 years ago from Maine to North Carolina all said, I love bringing my son, I love bringing my daughter on the boat, and I'm going to do everything I can to give them a shot at doing what I'm doing if they want to go down this path.
That's excellent. Those are wonderful words. And I think that, Sarah, when you're speaking about persistence and sort of shifting in going from one traditional path of activity in seafood to now having to be very versed in a wider area of doing business, right, and dealing with other people that might not feel as comfortable. But I wonder if for each of you, and if I could start with you, Sarah, have you seen specific innovations, especially over the last 2 years during this trying time globally, that you feel are helping meet more sustainability goals for fishermen, for our seafood industries, either locally or further out? Are there some innovations you've seen that are giving you hope for the future?
Yeah, it's getting involved in more than catching fish, basically. So that means getting involved in science. In Rhode Island, we have an organization, the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, which is admired up and down the coast. It's based here on URI's East Farm. And they do collaborative research that pairs scientists and fishermen together. They do like data collection on fishermen's boats so that fishermen see the whole process of how that science works. And both partners, both the scientists and the fishermen, learn from one another. Other states actually don't have that, is what I've realized. I mean, some may, but we really have like the pioneer here in our state. We did that. So that's something pretty cool that Rhode Island's fishing industry started. It's a fisherman-started, fisherman-led organization. Getting involved in retail. When I've talked to these young fishermen I interviewed up and down the coast, I remember one of them told me, you don't have a choice. If you want to stay in this industry, you have to manage your own market. You have to get involved in retail, or you're just at the mercy of so many factors beyond your control. And we saw that in Rhode Island, really, really exciting moment during COVID, that a lot of fishermen in this state had been saying for years, I want to market my own catch, I want to market my own catch, I want to be able to sell to my neighbors and friends direct from the boat, but that wasn't legal. They were required to sell to a dealer or a processor who would then, would go through the supply chain, possibly, go around the world and back before it got onto the shelves of our supermarkets. But COVID, threw everything into disarray, and so the state did a remarkably quick pivot and opened an emergency regulation here in Rhode Island, which has now become permanent law, enabling fishermen, if they so choose, to market. If they follow all the health protocols, keep it on ice, sell it within 24 hours, they can sell some species direct to the public. Not everybody has done that, not everybody wants to do that, but for people who want to go that extra step, that makes all the difference in the world for them. So just having options like that, getting involved in science, retail, advocacy are all the innovations that are really required nowadays to succeed as a fisherman, I think.
And then Monica and then Russell, have you also seen some specific examples of innovations over the last couple years?
Yeah, I would say, I absolutely agree with what Sarah said about fishermen getting more involved in research. I also, there's another thing that's been happening is, fishermen, what people used to say about them, and I don't actually know if it's true or not, was that fishermen were very private and they didn't share information among themselves. And as Sarah said, she went up and down the coast and she talked to people and she developed real relationships. And I see that happening more and more, this real communication and sharing of knowledge and experiences. It's not mean to say you're going to give away your favorite fishing spot, but there's a lot of other information that helps other people and helps newcomers to the industry. And that kind of information sharing is becoming more prevalent. And I want to say that is an innovation in the fishing industry. And the other thing is I've seen some innovations in fishing gear that are really great. They both lower, it reduces loss of, there's innovations gear that reduce loss of gear, but also reduce plastic pollution in the ocean. And those things are really good. The prices on those and the availability of those isn't quite ready, but it will come. And then in terms of aquaculture growing, I've seen quite a lot of innovation happening in terms of disease reduction, improvement in feeds, and that's good news for the fisheries industry, because more of the feeds are fish-free or have a very reduced amount of fish in them, which takes pressure off our fisheries. So a lot of these other things also are helping our fisheries. And then data, like just that everything is more data driven. There's more data being collected little by little. Hopefully that data will be collated and shared more than it is today, but at least now we're starting to collect it. And there's a number of technologies that have started to come up that allow us to collect data more passively while we're in the course of fishing or in the course of doing other things, and that's all really good news for our fisheries.
And I think I see some of the same things that both of you have talked about. I guess one thing I'd focus on is COVID having forced us to find different ways to communicate, and those different ways of communicating having the potential of opening up conversations, of engaging more people, of bringing new ideas to the table and to a broader swath of people. I mean, we actually had a conversation, Sarah, about how the Zoom putting public meetings where regulatory bodies are taking information from the public about and discussing how to manage fisheries, how opening those up through Zoom has allowed much greater participation from people who have other jobs, have other lives, have limitations on their ability to travel, whether it's financial or time-wise. And I think that allows for just a much greater, richer, better informed conversation about how we find ways to sustainably manage fisheries, both what the challenges are and what some of the solutions are that not only work for the fishers but also work for the stocks, for the ecosystem.
That's excellent. Now, I'm very impressed by your long view of involvement in fisheries, right? So your whole careers have been devoted to looking at, studying, supporting, enhancing, sustaining our seafood industries, or directly, indirectly, through policy, research, et cetera. It's really impressive, and I wonder, with those careers, but looking forward, and especially because of the pandemic, has there been something that really surprised you? So you've seen a lot and experienced a lot of innovations and research results and policy changes, but has there been something that really took you by surprise over the last couple of years that was really unexpected, hopefully for the better, in terms of our seafood sustainability goals being met? Is there anything that you saw, Sarah, in the last couple of years?
COVID surprises. It was, well, when COVID first hit, when sort of the big lockdown began and nobody knew what was going on, and there was the shortage of toilet paper and all that, one of the interesting things is that all of a sudden, like, half of Rhode Island and the surrounding states flocked down to Point Judith to buy lobsters. It's like, okay, the world's melting down, let's buy lobster. We've got one more day to live, let's go buy lobsters. There were the line of people lining up to buy lobsters and crabs off the fishermen was 3 miles long. It was complete pandemonium down there. That was a surprise. I still don't understand why that happened, but it was great that the first thing on everyone's mind when when society was collapsing was to get some fresh local seafood. So I don't exactly know what to make of that. And I guess it carried on, the uptick in people cooking at home was a real silver lining of COVID, and I know people, that included seafood, people who never cooked seafood before and were intimidated by it, decided to, get some fish and put it on a cutting board and figure it out, and that was pretty cool.
Well, and that's interesting. You were saying before the dockside sales that's Rhode Island sort of pioneered as an emergency measure is now formal regulation, and that really was what allowed customers to kind of come down to the docks, and that those sales were facilitated and were actually hopefully a value add for the fishermen too. Hopefully they got a little higher price, and so that's very good. Monica, any surprises?
So I think it's amazing that Rhode Island put that regulation in place, and very good. I also saw, more fishermen going direct to consumer And in some cases, what surprised me was how, like in the case what you're saying, in Rhode Island, it was a regulatory barrier. But I heard from fishermen that the barrier to going direct to consumer was that they hadn't bothered to put an internet line into their office. And so during COVID, they felt like they spent less time out on their boats. They had more time. They put an internet line in, and they were like, oh, I can have a web page now. And so what surprised me was more that the barrier was that low, where we tend to blow these. We are like, why aren't people going direct to consumer? And we make these like big theories and large programs. And really what we should be doing is being like, do you have internet? And, you know, is there regulation that's prohibiting this? But I think also when the stores were empty, people got more interested in local seafood and local products in general. And I think that was a really good thing. And I mean, it's too bad that it's because there's nothing in the stores, but hopefully they'll continue. One thing that was a huge surprise for me on a negative side was that seafood prices to consumers skyrocketed, and seafood prices to fishermen stayed the same, and sometimes even dropped, which I think is a demonstration of how broken that supply chain is in terms of supporting the fishermen. And so I think there's work to be done there, because we always assume if the market price rises that the fishermen will earn more, and we've seen that that's not the case this year. So I think there's work to be done to fixing that.
So for me, I guess from my perspective as a former manager, I think I was, at least at first, very disappointed at the inability of governments to come together and figure out how to manage at a time when in-person meetings was difficult. The collaboration, the co-management of these resources has always been difficult, but and at least initially, at least during the first year of the pandemic, it was kind of an utter failure. There was very little decision-making going on, very little collaboration. But I think the good news is that over the more recent period, over the last few months, we've actually started to see governments find ways to overcome the distance that's been enforced by COVID and by dealing with the pandemic and health concerns, and find ways to talk about and create management measures that actually could help manage these fisheries sustainably. So also hope that these types of mechanisms that are being developed will last beyond this period and inform and enhance our ability to work together across great distances, both culturally and time zones and geographically, to try and find ways to meet this need of collaborating on sustainably managing fisheries.
Can I ask a question? What was worse? COVID, communication breakdown during COVID, or communication breakdown during government shutdown?
Actually, communication breakdown, I think, during COVID. Because during government shutdown, there were still ways. I mean, it was just the U.S. government that was shut down, and there were, at least from the international perspective, there were ways to keep working with other governments that were actually able to function, not victims of the political chicanery that we're having to deal with.
Now I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball, because I didn't tell you I would ask this question, but I just thought of it. So if magically you were given one extra lifetime and you had to devote that lifetime to fisheries or aquaculture or some sort of seafood-related pursuit, what would be the one issue, or two, but one or so issue you would choose to focus on, and what would you do about it? Are there some solutions that you've gleaned through all of your hard work in this lifetime that you would apply to that particular issue in this magically given second lifetime? Does that make sense? Yes.
I would totally start a fish farm immediately. I would start a integrated fish and seaweed farm. And I feel like I don't have enough time to it to where I would want to grow it right now. But if I had a whole lifetime, I would totally do that, because we're going to need more fish. We're going to need seaweed, and we need people to really build those things. And in the course of doing that, as you said, Sarah, like now you're the spokesperson for fisheries, you can still do all this advocacy stuff. You can still do research. You can still work with all these people. You can make change happen, but you have a real showcase of what you want the world to be like and how you want to interact with science and everything else. So if I had a whole lifetime, I would totally do that.
And the issue would be meeting the demand for seafood. Is that sort of the issue?
Demand for seafood, science, you know, how do you want your businesses to contribute to science? How do you want the businesses to to partner with regulators? How do you want all of this stuff to work? And I think I would like to do it next time from the inside.
Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I'm trying to do it from the inside. And when you do it from the inside, you basically have to live 2 careers, and you definitely need that second lifetime. So I will take you up on that miracle offer, Azure, if you've got one to spare. I don't know. It sort of depends on the time. I mean, I feel like you mentioned cycles earlier, I think, Monica. Like, everything is, it's so in the moment. Like, right now, we have to solve climate change. We have to do that, and we have to do it now. You know, it depends. If this lifetime is going to be after the end of my hopefully long existing lifetime, God knows what
You're
the
getting
issues
way
are
too
gonna be
technical.
there.
Whatever you'd like.
But yeah, I mean, the issues, I don't know, climate change and sort of the need to preserve and restore fishery habitat are to me the most important things that I hope to dedicate this lifetime to, and even to make a small scratch on the surface of these problems in one lifetime is a tall order. So I would just keep on doing what I'm doing. And hopefully do it better after having learned all the, you know, made all the mistakes the first time around.
That's great. Russell.
If there was one issue, I think it might be improving the translation of science knowledge into management actions. First of all, it's a difficult conversation. People are speaking very different languages, coming from very different places, and there are that creates room for doubt and questioning. Our current system also keeps in place ways of political influence coming into play in decision making about the management of stocks. So issues, political pressures, undermining our ability to base our decision making on sound science. And there's work going on now, and it's been going on for a while, on trying to change that discussion, that interface, so that scientific information becoming available then more immediately leads to specific results, specific types of management, decisions about management of stocks that sort of segregated from the negotiations. But
that's great.
That would be an amazing life.
Now we just have to figure out how to get the magical second lifetime, but we'll work out that before the next panel. My next question for you all would be, Monica, if we could start with you, is what solutions have you seen that are either being proposed or hopefully instituted that really are getting at some of the problems we're seeing? What solutions are out there now that you feel really have a shot at ensuring a future of seafood for all of us?
Well, I mean, the good news is there's a lot of them. And, you know, as with any world where there's a lot of different things, we don't know which ones will stick. They're not, the ones that don't stick and that don't succeed, they won't have failed because they're bad ideas. They'll fail because of something else. They didn't have the right team, they ran out of money, they didn't, you know, they ran into some kind of a hurt, someone got sick. Like, there's a million reasons why these things happen. So I think, but the good news is there's a lot of great ideas out there. There's so many different levels of issues in the oceans. I mean, the ones that I like, that most attract me right now, let's say, are the ones that take something that was a waste product, because I don't know, all of you know, but you know, the waste in most fisheries is about at 40%. It's a pretty high degree of waste in fisheries, and a lot of people are working to bring that down. And you know, some of the best solutions are one where the waste becomes the next product. And you know, there's people making bone broth out of fish cuttings and fish bones and things like that. And the fish bone broth is super nutritious and people love it. And there's people using fish skin for various products. And I think those are great because it doesn't require taking more resources out. And it creates a very positive cycle and solves other problems that we have. I think that the growth of aquaculture is one thing that's really exciting. And I hope that it continues, and I hope people support it and kind of see aquaculture for what it is today in 2021, which is very different than what aquaculture was in even the 1990s. And I think if people can see it for what it is today and the impacts it has today, then we could start to have a different conversation about it.
Sarah, do you have thoughts on solutions you're seeing to some of our big problems that you think are really working?
Yeah, so at the management level, which is, I mean, management really determines everything at the end of the day in fisheries. There's only so much that a private individual fisherman can do. A lot of it ultimately is in the hands, because we are fishing on a public resource in public waters. You know, a lot of these solutions ultimately are determined at the management table, you know. And I see management heading in a positive direction, although it's often hard to get there and takes longer than it should. But I mean, climate change is sort of it's such a game changer that it's sort of forcing us to reevaluate the whole paradigm under which we've managed fisheries for the last 40 plus years. And from a fisherman's perspective, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It sort of opens up new opportunities to sort of shake things up a little. And one of, to me, the most exciting things that's happening in New England right now is that the New England Fisheries Management Council is going on a roadshow this winter to get stakeholder input on its new example fishery ecosystem plan. Now, this is getting a little wonky, but fishery ecosystem plans are sort of they're the way we should be managing fisheries but never have. So we've always managed fisheries sort of on a stock-by-stock basis, saying, you know, species X, let's say bluefish should, you know, there should be this much in the ocean, we should catch this much, and there should be this much reproducing next year. You know, striped bass should be X, Y, Z. You know, managing each fish as if they weren't swimming in the same ocean, eating each other, eating the same food, being eaten by the same things, and yet they are. So this new way of managing things, which is called ecosystem-based fisheries management, recognizes that and manages the whole ecosystem as a system. And once we start thinking about things in a systematic way, we can also begin to realize that the food system and the market system are also a system, and they're integrated into that ecosystem. And so to me, that is like a very exciting. It's not an easy transition to make, but it's high time that we make that transition. And we're starting to do that in New England and around the country, which is really exciting.
So will they change, like, how fisheries are, like, permitting and everything to ecosystem-based?
It could. The future is wide open. Mm-hmm. So the New England Fishery Management Council, which is the entity that manages federal waters fisheries from Maine, you know, to Connecticut, is putting this sort of proposal on the table for stakeholders to think about. It's not even a public comment period. Mm-hmm. They're not even at that level of formality yet. It's more of just sort of a roadshow to talk about what if we did this? How would you feel? You know, what are the pitfalls? What are the pros? What are the cons? Because it's a major, you know, people have lots and lots of money invested in their permits. You know, to catch fish, you don't just need a boat and the gear, you need a permit. You need access. That permit gives you access to catch certain kinds and certain amounts of fish. And those have value. So doing any sort of like dramatic change up of a management system means that value could change. So, so the future is wide open, but I think that because of climate change, the status quo is not an option anymore. Mm-hmm. We know the future is going to be different one way or the other, so we might as well make it a future we choose rather than one we just kind of wind up with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I guess just if I picked one, I would point to the technology that is improving the way in which we conduct aquaculture. It is a very important source of seafood for both this country and the world, but it is a production model that has been very problematic, both because of the pollution created, the biological hazards created, some of the feed sources, and as we have learned more and forced ourselves to think more about how do we do this in ways that, for example, can integrate a number of different types of species to work together to allow the waste from one species to become the food for another species, as we've looked at closed cycle systems, as we've looked at even for net pens, different types of structures for net pens that don't allow escapement, that can actually keep waste and food from expanding out, from flowing out from the pen into the oceans. We create better products, and we create a more sustainable source of food, and hopefully a more palatable source of food, so that we can start to work past some of the barriers that are keeping us from truly pursuing aquaculture in the U.S.
And I want to say that some of the innovations, they're not really fisheries innovations, they're energy innovations or water innovations, and those are helping aquaculture. So there's also a number of innovations that are happening in other fields that are really exciting for the field of fisheries and aquaculture. And you know, the more people that look towards fisheries and aquaculture as a place to apply and think about utilization of their innovations, the better off we'll be, because not everything is going to happen within the field of fisheries.
And is that what the 2.0, Fish 2.0 model can do, is bring those sectors together that are innovating to the aquaculture and wild capture space?
Tried, or? Actually, that wasn't something that we did on purpose, but it was something that happened, and actually we did notice at one point we did a little survey of all of the top entrepreneurs that were coming through Fish 2.0, and something like 85% of the best ideas came from outside of fisheries and were being applied to fisheries. And they were putting really good fisheries scientists and people that had worked in the fishery and working with fishing communities and other people directly. But I feel like sometimes because they were new to the field, they were really listening. They were really listening to people about what their issues were, how it works, how things work, because they were learning as they went. They weren't assuming, they had no assumptions. And so, yeah, a lot of innovations are coming from outside, but they need to be implemented hand in hand with the people that know the industry, because the industry does, as you say, demands very specific conditions. It has to work under specific regulations.
And could you maybe just back up one step I should have asked is, could you give a quick descriptor of what Fish 2.0 has done or aims to do, just for those who are unfamiliar, for context?
Fish 2.0 is a platform that we created to grow the investment into and innovations in the seafood sector. And you know, that involved a lot of things. It involved working with entrepreneurs and helping them really be in what we call investment ready, which is learn how to package and present your business for investment, know when you're ready for investment, which type of investors to go to. And then it also involved a lot of education of investors, because investors only invest in things they know, and a lot of them don't know anything about fisheries. So we have to teach them, as you say, you have to be a spokespeople, you have to explain to your customers, to your investors, to everyone what you're doing. And involve bringing the people together and getting them to trust each other. And then, you know, really a lot of stuff, you know, as we know, because a lot of you are scientists, it's okay, you can always describe your project big picture, but the devil is in the details. And so, you know, there are 1,001 details under that you have to think about, is like, how do we structure this? How do we structure this? How can we get, what can we tell investors about structuring financing for fisheries that will work? And, you know, some things are that if you're running an aquaculture business, you're not going to be on a 10-year horizon to repay a loan. Most aquaculture businesses need at least a 20 to 25-year horizon to really make money. It takes time to work through a lot of issues, but that's an education thing for the investors. They have to know that. The business has to not accept money that's only for 10 years, because they will go bankrupt after 10 years, we can guarantee it. So there's, you know, those things have to all be put in place together so that everyone comes to a happy ending, rather than being really upset and saying aquaculture is bad, because aquaculture is not bad, it's that you didn't have the right structure.
Well, that makes me think of another question, and Russell, you brought this up. Are there misconceptions that you all have seen, whether in wild harvest, capture fisheries, or aquaculture, that the public has or that people have about what it is or what it looks like, that you could clear up today? I wonder, Sarah, is there something from your perspective that you see as a misconception you hear a lot, or from any level?
Yeah, I don't know where to begin, I guess.
Pick the top 5.
This is like Sarah's life.
One thing that gets me in the media is how they take cod, which is, you know, an iconic New England species, as they always say, and they act as if it represents the entire ecosystem. It's just one of many, 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 many fish that are out there. And it is true that the cod population is not what it once was. But that does not mean the oceans are empty. I'm not saying that that doesn't matter. You know, it can, depending on your point of view. If you think that we should have a lot more cod than we do, then it's a sad thing that we don't. If you think that fish are, just having fish is good, then it may not matter to you as much. I mean, what I'm saying is that there's sort of like a very specific judgment that's imposed on those scientific facts, and then all of the other, like, reality is sort of excluded. And you see this in the media again and again and again. And I think it leads to to a public perception that, you know, fisheries are destructive, fisheries management has failed across the board, there's nothing left in the ocean, none of which are true.
Russell, maybe from an aquaculture perspective, or certainly capture fisheries, is there some misconceptions you'd like to clear up? Mike?
I think I would like to emphasize just how complex in particular, the management of wild capture fisheries is. Moving from collecting data, understanding what's happening in the ocean, in our fisheries. A piece of what we're still struggling with is integrating indigenous knowledge, integrating knowledge from fishers and other sources of knowledge that aren't considered traditional science. Understanding how all of this, how the ecosystem functions to support or not support fisheries, understanding what the ecosystem is and how the various components interact. We have to take into, we have to begin to better understand the impact that things like climate, plastics, have on the ways in which we actually harvest, have on the populations and on the ecosystem, and how that then feeds into the health of the various fisheries. I just think that it's easy to say, you have science, the science tells you how much you should be catching, why can't you just do that? But in fact, it is much more complex. And another factor that I think you must take into account is that fisheries are a way of livelihood. And as you try to manage your fisheries, you have to take into account how that impacts the livelihood of the fishers and those who depend on that as employment. And you have to find ways to ensure the sustainability, because if the fish disappear, then that employment is going to disappear, that source of income is going to disappear. But as you have different choices about how you manage, how you try to address these issues, you have to take these things into account.
Monica, complex, not so complex.
Well, I agree with what both of you said. I also, like, on a different note, I would say one big misconception that people have is that seafood is hard to cook. And I've literally never seen anything easier to cook. I mean, you can eat it raw. I mean, we eat it raw. And so it's like one of the most forgiving things. Like, if you take a piece of chicken or pork, you can't eat it raw. You will get sick. But fish is super, like, if you get a good piece of fresh, you really have to do nothing. And people, somehow they think that fish is harder to cook than other things. And I'm like, butter and garlic, pretty much done. And, or just, if it's fresh enough, eat it raw. And it's fine. Cook it however you want. It is one of the easiest to make proteins that's out there. It's literally easier than eggs are, and no one says eggs are hard to cook. and so I think we have to get over kind of our cultural barriers to cooking seafood and eating seafood at home. Everyone thinks that it has to be perfect, and they don't realize that it's not that hard.
Well said. And we're sort of coming to the end of our time, but I did have one more question for you all. Sarah, what would be a call to action or something you'd like the audience to take home? Or what can they go home and do after tonight's conversation?
Well, you can eat a slipper limpet. You can eat a dogfish. Eat a green crab. Really just push yourself outside of your comfort zone. Eat something new. Every time you eat seafood, try something new, local, of course. And also think about where that seafood came from and take some action to contribute back to the habitat that produced that seafood. So, if that means hanging your clothes on the line instead of running your dryer to limit those greenhouse gas emissions, or if it means foregoing applying fertilizer, or pesticides to your lawn, those are all things that can help sustain the habitat that produces our wild seafood. So always reciprocate when you eat a delicious, wonderful piece of seafood that maybe not gave its life for you, but its life was ended by me for you. Do something to give back to the place that produced that fish.
Russell?
So I think that the fact that you all are here or there on the internet is a really good thing, and I guess I'd encourage people to stay engaged. Seafood is a very important resource, and understanding what's happening with this resource, how it's being managed, whether it is being managed sustainably or honestly, is important. And having people pay attention and talk about it, keeping it in the forefront is what's going to help us make sure that it is here for generations to come.
Monica, bring us home.
So in the same vein, I would say we are the people that we have been waiting for. And I often hear this us and them conversation. I wish they would just do this. I wish they would just take care of that. I wish they would change the way this thing is. And I always tell people, we are they. And so if you see something that you're unhappy with, if you see something that you're happy with, engage with it. We are the people. There is no one else. And you all live in this beautiful place on the coast. You have access to local people that are engaged. You have access to international people. You have access to all these beautiful programs. I mean, get involved. And don't wait for other people to get involved, because quite often, like, you are the person that we need. And there's no prerequisite for that. So,
Beautifully put. I think we do have time for maybe a question or two, JP, would you say? Or is there any questions from the audience before we wrap up? Free. We have a mic, too, to make it easier. You don't have to shout. Yep, right here in the middle.
This is sort of an economics question. We talked about prices at the dock during COVID being low, and yet retail prices being high. That's so often a factor of sort of market access. If there's one broker at the dock, the broker's price is going to prevail. And the fish can end up in the hands of someone who could sell the fish, across the country or across the planet. And so they can tap the greatest demand and get the greatest prices. Do we know where Rhode Island fish goes?
Sarah, that would be a great one.
I missed the last part of the question.
Do we know where Rhode Island fish goes? Was that the last part?
Mm-hmm.
Not really, right? I mean, CRC did a study of where scup goes, right? Do you want?
Well, I think, and you were saying,
or?
so there's this price change that the fishermen don't necessarily feel. Where is this fish
Right.
going?
Well, an example was in Maine, there was, maybe it still is, sort of this flash market of sea urchins. And they knew they were going to Japan. And it was so fast and so obvious that the hands that the sea urchins passed through, everyone knew what was going on. So a lot of the money did trickle down to the people who were catching the sea urchins. And that was the case where Japan just wanted all of them. And so that drove the price. But, if we have, something that's not worth much at the dock in Rhode Island, comparatively, and it's going to, I don't know, South Korea or Miami Beach, I suppose, and they're buying a whole bunch of it, that drives the price up, and the fishermen aren't getting their share. So it'd just be interesting to know how that stuff spreads out.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it matters where the fish are going to. I think it's what you say, like there's a long supply chain and there's some gatekeepers. So there is often only one broker. Even if there's multiple people buying fish, people tend to pay fishermen the same price season after season after season, and it's very rare. And they've started to do it in some places. There started to be fishermen that come together and really say, we know what the market price is, and why aren't we getting a bigger piece of it? And, there's a lot of pushback by the industry on that, and there will be, but I think, as you said, Sarah, persistence and dedication and passion and all those things have to come into play, because it shouldn't be working that way, and there's a lot of reasons why it does. I mean, I've heard from some of the distributors, they say, well, our costs rose because of COVID. Well, the fishermen would say, our costs rose because of COVID too, but we got paid the same. So I don't think that's an excuse, but I think we have to really start to work through that argument and be much more transparent about it. I think it's, as Russell says, management is very difficult, and it's going to be a complex long-term fix. But the most important thing right now is to table the conversation and have it out in the open and not just in back rooms.
Yeah, I mean, and please, go ahead. Yep, we do have one more.
I rent to a fisherman who owns 4 boats. And he's got a truck now going to Boston. So that's where his product is leaving. So it's not even, no longer going in Rhode Island. Of course, I talked to him and prices are better in Boston. So he's trucking it all the way to Boston. But more important, yes, he owns 4 boats. But the government restriction on the fish, the amount of fish, I imagine, out of the 4 boats, he's lucky to have 2, sometimes 1 boat running, because he's not allowed the volume. Is the government in tune to control? Are they controlling such that they're putting them out of business? From my perspective, their control in stopping him from fishing, but I don't know what kind of fish he does, lobsters, but the government essentially has shut down 2 to 3 boats, as far as I can say. I see his family. I've seen him. For the last 20 years, I've watched. He's got 2 sons now, where he probably had 10 employees before. From my perspective, he's going out of business. And from my perspective, because of the government saying you can't do this, you can only have so many pounds of this, or like you said, it's just the government is controlling the volume that he's allowed to catch, even though he has the capacity. So is that what the government's doing now? We want to stop the fishermen from overfishing. Therefore, they're controlling this. You can't get this, you can't do this, you can't do this.
Right,
and if they are, then they're going to put them out of business. And I see that happening now. Is that going to stop? Are we going to aquaculture? Is it going to that's going to get rid of the fishermen?
Right.
I don't know. But right now, the government involvement, I don't have confidence in it from my 20-year perspective.
No, that's a great question. Thank you. Did you want to comment a little bit about regulations in Rhode Island? Because every state is different. Obviously, across the world, it differs. But Sarah, you have direct experience here in Rhode Island.
Sure. Well, I mean, all I can say is that there's nothing easy about it. When being a fisherman, you take your dreams, your aspirations, and if you own your own boat, you have to make a major investment in that. If you own multiple boats, that's even more. And then all of that is at the mercy of Mother Nature, the market, and yes, the government. Because that's the bargain that we make. We decide we're going to fish a wild public resource, and that comes with the territory. The government is shorthand for a lot of different, councils and commissions, et cetera, who are going through extensive science-based deliberative processes with lots of stakeholder engagement to make painful decisions that involve a lot of trade-offs. So when I say government, I'm encompassing all of that. The decisions they make are never going to make everybody 100% happy. And sometimes it's really easy to focus on the negative, and there certainly are people who are, disproportionately affected and have had to make, have suffered painful losses, in even to the extent where their business is no longer viable. So there is that real, uncertainty and economic pain that can result. It's partly just, aquaculture may not have to deal with that because it's a more controlled.
I'm not sure they would.
It's a more, I think, but maybe I'm wrong. But you can answer.
They feel regulated.
You privately have more control over,
maybe.
Your lease.
Well, but fish disease is a big deal, and creates a lot of uncertainty. I would say I know people. I feel this way. I always say I feel this way every April when I have to pay my taxes. I love to be like, oh my God, the government. I have to write this check. But I have never met a single person in government in the US, let's say in the US, that is trying to destroy a fisherman or a fishery. In fact, exactly the opposite. And yeah, I really honestly have never met anyone that has kind of like ill will towards fishermen and or towards the fishing industry. And on the other side, these guys are giving their careers to trying to make our fisheries better and sustainable. And I agree with us, it is a super complex process. There are winners and losers in it. And, you know, and I think the more people get involved in those processes, there's always a public comment period. You have to get really close to it to understand what's going on, and so it doesn't take you by surprise. And I know the people that get the most upset about it are the ones that didn't get involved, they weren't a part of the conversation, and they feel like this just came down on them. And so I say get involved, at least you'll understand what's happening even if you can't control it. But I don't think there's ill will anywhere in the system. I think people are trying to watch out for the long term of the fisheries. And I mean, US fisheries are quite sustainable as a result. And so people are able to make investments. Now, there's issues with investment, but that's not because of the regulation.
Great, great answer.
So we are just about out of time. I had one quick question maybe to wrap up on, which I think you've given us a lot of really hopeful comments, which is really nice. Many of us probably are just going to interact with seafood as consumers, and I think we probably all hear this cacophony of concerns about plastics or overfishing or lost habitat, and I'm curious, maybe you could leave us with a message of, should we eat seafood, and how do we eat seafood? What do you tell people like us that when you go to the store to buy something, how do we feel, should we feel good about it, and how do we buy?
So I think we should eat seafood. I've, worked for many years to try and ensure that we are sustainably managing our seafood so that people can consume it. And I think that this is another place where an informed consumer is the ideal consumer. So asking questions about what the source of your seafood is both lets you understand where the seafood's coming from and have some sense of whether it has been harvested in a manner that is sustainable, whether it has been harvested in a manner that doesn't involve forced labor, and to put in a plug for U.S. seafood. If you buy seafood that's been harvested in the U.S., you have a pretty good chance of ensuring that. But also by asking questions, you force the providers of seafood to think about these issues, to understand where seafood is coming from, and to let them know that you care.
I think we should all eat more seafood. I think you should eat seafood. I think you should preferentially buy it from people you can have a conversation with about seafood. So direct from the boat. That's your best choice. You can have a whole conversation with Sarah about where she caught it, how she caught it, what happened when she was out there fishing for it. That's like your top choice. If not, at least from a fishmonger that knows who he bought it from and can tell you about that. If not, from a supermarket where someone behind the stand is able to tell you a little bit about that, or from a restaurant where the chef cares enough about where they buy it from that they're able to talk about it. So I think buy it, eat it, enjoy the fact that it came from, a beautiful, healthy ocean. But talk to people about it, and the more people can talk about it, the more you'll enjoy it. I mean, I think we're discovering that about all our food, not just our seafood.
Sarah?
I agree with all that's been said. Yeah, I think you should eat seafood. I don't think you should consume seafood. I don't think you should approach it with the attitude of a consumer, but rather towards the idea of having a relationship with that seafood and the place that produced it. If I recall, I'm trying to recall what Crystal said at the beginning here. She said, the land does not belong to man, man belongs to the land. So we can say the same of sea, that the sea doesn't belong to us, we belong to the sea. And seafood is by incorporating part of the ecosystem of the sea into your own body's nutrition, you really forge that relationship. But it can't stop there. If you want to read a really wonderful book, I recommend American Catch by Paul Greenberg. He goes into this whole concept of how eating our own, local wild seafood and cultivating that relationship is really key to protecting, sustaining our shores here in America, which traditionally has not been, as he says, a very fishy country. This is a relationship that has traditionally been underdeveloped, which is why it was so wonderful to see during COVID that people started working on that relationship a little bit more. And you don't just have to buy seafood, you can go out and catch it yourself too. And that really deepens that relationship.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. It's been an honor, and we are very grateful for your time and your expertise, and safe travels, and eat more seafood, all of you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Just say a quick last minute thank you to all of you for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. And everybody online, thank you all for watching. This concludes the panel for the evening. Please come back next week for Dr. Chelsea Rockman as we start the last phase of the colloquium focused on marine plastics. Thank you all.